Hi, I Kunal Jha would like to welcome you all to another insightful meeting with extramural lectures, IIT Madras. Today we have with us veteran army personnel Mr. Probal Dasgupta. He is an associating managing director at Kroll's India and South Asia Business Intelligence and Investigation Practice. He advises global clients on a business intelligence, investigation, market entry risk, and political risk. He has led projects for multinational infrastructure firms in high-risk, volatile area of North Indian states of Jammu and Kashmir, and that often involves quick turnarounds. Has advised firms in mining and oil gas sector and identified local political risks, government corporate governance issues, competitive risk, and supply chain risks in the eastern states India. Now, I'd like to request Mr. Probal Dasgupta to address this session.
Thank you, Kunal. Really appreciate your introduction, and thanks Nandiga and everyone in the IIT team to have given me this opportunity to speak this afternoon. Thank you all for gathering on a Saturday afternoon. I know it's not very easy, especially when you're at school or when you're in your program and you have to take time off. And towards this end of a Saturday, hear a talk or be involved in some session. So, one of the things I thought I would do is to make it interesting and relevant for you, and go through a few things in the first 15-20 minutes and then leave the stage to you to ask questions. The subject, Kings and Knights, is an interesting one, but before I get there, I'll just sort of give you a little bit more about what Kunal said. Go through a few things. I think there's an echo, Kunal.
Yeah. I just sorted it out. Sorry for that.
Sure, no worries. So Kunal, thanks for the introduction, but there's a bit of a correction there. I'm on my way from Kroll to another firm, which I shall be joining in about a week or so. So that's the little difference here. But all that you said that I do is part of what my professional corporate life is all about, and will be in the coming future as well. So having said that, let's come to the subject of the discussion. As I said, the subject of any discussion can either be very dry or very interesting. So let's try and see what we can do with this. The reason why I thought this is an important subject for you and for us, I know IIT has a humanities wing as well. And whether we are in humanities or sciences, arts, technology, or any form, given that politics, corporate issues, technical issues, all of this overlaps today in various forms. We are seeing that with the India-China relations. It's not just political alone. There is also the issue of Chinese apps. There is also the issue of investment, Chinese investment in India. There is also the issue of Indian firms having back offices in China, or the supply chain issues. Several business issues, several technological issues are interconnected with the political narratives that are there between countries today. So you cannot isolate one from the other. You cannot say, I belong to this stream and I don't belong to that stream. So that is one of the beauties of the current age, that we are in a place where all the interstices kind of overlap each other. All the roads cross each other, and we are all sitting at crossroads trying to figure out where the next turn will be. So Kings and Knights is a subject that is more than the military and the political class, actually speaking. But the fact of the matter is, the subject is not just of relevance today. It has been of relevance for a long time. And when we talk about the role of the generals, which is, I assume, when I say generals, I don't mean to ignore the admirals or the Air Force chiefs. It's a proverbial use that, the head of the armed forces and the minister class, the prime ministers, how do they interact? And what has been the issues that have been, the outcomes of the interactions in the last so many decades? It's important to understand in the context of India particularly so because if you look around the neighborhood, India is in a neighborhood of utmost chaos. I think somebody's microphone is on. It'd be great if you can switch off the microphones. Otherwise, the kind of echo here. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, if you look around the neighborhood and you look at Sri Lanka, you look at Bangladesh, you look at Pakistan, lately Myanmar, and you look at Maldives, you look at Afghanistan, you look at China in a different way, authoritarian. But if you look at all these countries that surround India, India is the only democratic glue that binds the entire region of several kind of political infirmities, military political friction, internal dissent, and various other things that have kind of run through their entire history. If you look at all of these countries, they've either had coups or have had dictatorial governance or have had some kind of military political friction. Nepal is the other name that crops up in my mind. So there's no exception except for India, and that is the reason why we, as students of this country, and I don't segregate between any subjects, students of this country must understand, or to see, or to study. I mean, I'm a student myself, or to delve deeper to see where and how and why India remains what it is, which is a democracy governed by its political class, but has a significantly active military, which has been playing a major role in its wars and conflicts over the last few decades, and also in its internal conflicts such as insurgencies and several other kinds of issues that India has had in the past and currently does so, with the implicit assumption that the military class will not launch a coup and take over the governance of India. So, that kind of arouses our curiosity in many ways as to why this happens in India. Why is who we are? How do we maintain this equilibrium? And this is when we look at these unstable democracies and these various other countries around India, it becomes more imperative that we understand where this equation lies. I wrote a book, Watershed 1967. Some of you may have read it, some of you may have heard of it. One of the things I always talk about is that the book is not about the battles that India won against China alone. The book is also a turning point, talks about a turning point in military, political, or military civil relations that happened in the 60s. And that's why I would also talk a little bit about what I have mentioned in the book. But before I get to that, let me start with how the military political complex have remained mutually exclusive of each other in India, despite the various challenges, and have occasionally had blips also along the way. So if you look at this equation, the tango between prime ministers and generals, the best way, or the most relevant way, I always believe, because I'm also a historian, is to look back and see where it all started. Because the roots of everything lies in the history of its beginnings. When I say history of its beginnings, the beginning and the history that followed. So it takes us back to 1947, and we all know that the freedom movement was essentially a very political movement that we had. The freedom fighters who dominated the movement came to form the government that followed, whether it was Jawaharlal Nehru, whether it was Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, and everybody else who was there as a part of the initial cabinet. But we also understand that the army, the Indian army which existed, was actually a British construct. The British construct followed into the making of the country post 1947. So initially, when you had politicians running the country, those politicians at that point of time had very little connect with the Indian army per se, because the Indian army was an outcome of a British administration, And when the Indian Army followed into, the British Army became the Indian Army post 1947, it was still seen with some degree of a mix of curiosity and suspicion by the political class that formed the first government of India post 1947. I'll give you a little story that will be interesting to sort of get an understanding of what I'm trying to say. For instance, there was a British general, General Lockhart, who was commanding the areas after 1947, and there was also the partition that was taking place where people were moving from Pakistan to India and India to Pakistan. At that point of time, tribals in Pakistan, in the northwest frontier and in the Rawalpindi Attock area, were actually preparing to take Kashmir. Remember, Kashmir was not a part of India, neither a part of India nor a part of Pakistan at that point of time. These tribals were making these plans. So there was an Indian commander-in-chief called General Lockhart. There was a Pakistani commander-in-chief called General Darcy. Both were in conversations, and General Darcy, both were British, right? So both were in conversations over the phone. They would talk every day. And General Darcy, who was commander-in-chief of the Pakistani forces, told General Lockhart, who was then the commander-in-chief here in India, that look, there are tribals who are preparing. I don't know why they're preparing, and they're amassing arms and preparing themselves for a military campaign. We do not know what it is. General Lockhart both the generals didn't believe that Kashmir was in dispute at that point of time, because nobody had really raised a military question to it at that point of time. So General Lockhart did not share the information with the political class or the cabinet, or it did not reach Prime Minister Nehru at that point of time, Prime Minister in waiting. So Nehru called General Lockhart and asked him why he forgot, whether his loyalty lay on the other side with the Pakistanis. General Lockhart's reply was that, look, there is a boat leaving 2 days' time from India, taking all the soldiers and military men from England who want to go back to England. I'll be on that boat. The point he was making was that, he was suspecting a general of siding with the other side. The point that I'm trying to make is there was always a suspicion, whether it was and then when General Lockhart had left, there was an Indian general who had come in, General Cariappa was the first Indian general, and then the other generals followed in the 50s. However, there was a deep suspicion that, there was no, which resulted in very little coordination between the army and the political class, especially between the prime minister and or the defense minister on one side and the army chief on the other side. There was a belief that the army was not required at that point of time. That was a political belief of the prime minister. And in the 1950s, especially in 1950, when China had invaded Tibet, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel had raised the issue with the prime minister, saying that, look, we need to be careful about how China is planning its advance and its accumulating territory. There was also a threat posed by the ambition of China at that point of time. However, India's thinking at that point of time was, it did not include the essential parts such as proactive foreign policy, military preparedness, defense policy, etc. In fact, when the British commander-in-chief at that point of time had presented to Nehru the tenets of a defensive policy, Prime Minister Nehru had said that, well, it was not required at all. So in the 1950s, General Sri Nagesh was the first general army chief who had flagged that issue to the Prime Minister, that, look, the Chinese are making roads in Aksai Chin. However, the trust deficit between the army and the political class at that point of time was quite large, which meant that those inputs were never taken seriously. Subsequently, I'm just taking you through a little bit of history that, what happened. You had a defense minister called Krishna Menon, who also was not very much favorable to the suggestions of the army. It was in 1959 when General Thimaia, one of our most revered generals, had actually tasked another general called General SPP Thorat to carry out an analysis of the India-China border and India's preparedness vis-a-vis China. The result of that commission, of that report of the army led by General Thorat, was an eye-opener. General Thorat said and recommended that India should not go to a war with China because Indian army at that point of time was under-budgeted, under-prepared, and the chances of success in a war was not very high. However, that file that General Thorat had put in terms of his report was never shown to the Prime Minister. And in 1962, when India and China went to war, some of the actions that were taken by the political leadership were not in consonance with the military strategy that should have been there. I do not only blame the political class, I also blame the military leadership at that point of time, who could not stand up or face up to the political leadership or, give them the right kind of advice so as to not lead us to disaster. But, preceding the 1962 India-China war, what had happened was, because the political leadership and the military leadership had a lot of gap and a lot of mistrust amongst each other, there were military leaders put in place who were yes men, basically, who could not stand up to political leadership or decisions, and who would just go by whatever was demanded of them. So General Thapar, who made it to the chief of the Indian Army at that point of time, was later accused of not being strong enough to stand up to the political class. Then, of course, you had General Kroll, who led India into the war and who fell sick, who could not lead from the front at that point of time. All such appointees at that point of time of the political leadership actually meant that India's strategic preparedness was not of the highest degree, because the political class didn't trust the earlier military class, and they replaced it with a military leadership that could only pander to what they thought was right, which actually was a recipe for disaster. One of the reasons why, if you look at the various things up until 1962, given the lack of harmony between the prime minister, the ministers, and the military leaders, which led to lack of preparedness, and then you had a disaster in waiting, and India suffered a huge setback in 1962 against China because of the lack of the lack of cohesion between the prime minister, the defense minister, and the military leaders on the other side. But that was, if we look at it in retrospect, it was a sort of military, it was sort of a blessing in disguise. And it so happened after 1962, leading up to 1965, and that was a turning point as far as India is concerned. My book talks about 1965. It starts from 1965, because, at that point of time, post the disaster against China in 1962, India started importing weapons, raised 10 military divisions. There was a mutual exclusivity in decision-making insofar as the political and military leadership was concerned. Though civilian supremacy in decision-making was always there, but the military leadership was given its space in terms of how it would operate within the ambit. And that's how you had a different Defense Minister Chauhan, who, of course, gave military their space in terms of their decision-making, etc. And that the feedback was adhered to, and they also kind of could take decisions on their own. One of the things that happened in 1965, and you had a new Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri. So in 1965, when Pakistan, in concert with China, And the book Watershed talks about how Pakistan and China were actually acting in concert against India. The plan, there was a secret plan. The secret plan was that China walks into Sikkim, Pakistan moves in to Kashmir, and Kashmir is bartered for Sikkim to be returned to Indian side. Sikkim was not a part of India, but was certainly a very important part, given that it bordered the recently invaded Tibet, that was the Chinese side on the other side. So Tibet and Sikkim bordered each other, and Tibet had been occupied by China. So Sikkim was therefore very important for India. So the two-front war that China and Pakistan had envisaged in 1965 didn't quite take place, because India thwarted Pakistan's attempt to go into Kashmir. Also, it was the first time that India had actually, the Prime Minister heeded the advice of the army chiefs and launched a counterattack inside Pakistan. And that was a political decision again, a political decision taken or implemented by the armed forces. When military chiefs, defense minister, and prime minister move in cohesion, some of these things are better executed. Insofar as an army of this nature, this stature, this big country, India, is concerned. So it's important when you go to wars that everybody's on the same page, which happened in 1965. In 1967, 2 years later, India paid back China. China thought that it would be a rerun of 1962. But at that point of time in 1967, there was a general called General Sagat Singh, who gave back China on its own coin and actually registered two back-to-back victories, which we, over a period of time of 50 years, forgot. But those two victories ensured that China would never interfere, apart from other reasons that are there indeed. But that ensured that the psychological dominance which China had wrested in 1962 was gotten back by India in 1967. General Sagat, I say this in the context of today's discussion, it was an important decision by General Sagat that turned the tide in India's favor. The Chinese had taken the advantage in the 1967 battles by opening up fire and being aggressive first, as they always are. We normally have been on the reactive mode. Even then we were, but we were better prepared under General Sagat. So General Sagat took them on, and, the artillery was the only way, using the artillery because it could clear the ridge and go onto the Chinese side and destroy the Chinese bunkers and their roads and their other establishment massively. But to use the artillery, General Sagat had to obtain the permission from Delhi. Imagine that was the kind of bureaucracy that was there, and still continued to be there for a long time. So General Sagat realized that if he was to wait for that, he would have to pay by losing another battle with China. So he had a leadership dilemma at a level of a general. Should I obey the protocol and make sure that I get the okay from the Prime Minister, or should I disregard the protocol because it's a higher calling to protect the integrity of my country, the territorial integrity of my country? So he ignored the protocol and took on the higher calling. So when there is a dilemma between the military arm and the political arm, and there is a lack of time, and this applies to leadership at all levels, we all face dilemmas. So the learning there is that decide which is the higher calling. General Sagat decided that the territorial integrity and its protection was the higher calling, and therefore used the artillery. When Prime Minister Indira Gandhi heard that the artillery had been used, and because the permission, the requirement for the permission, the entire process did take place, and somebody came to ask her for permission. By that time, it had already happened. She just nodded. So there was a change, there was a shift in the political response to military leadership. They did not hold General Sagat responsible for that, because it was a victory for India. But at the same time, it was a decision taken at the ground level by the military commander on ground, and the Prime Minister acquiesced, agreed, post facto though. So that was the start of a leadership where the prime minister, in breaking from the previous practice, was closer to the army. In 1965, when the Indian army captured the Hajipir Pass, Mrs. Indira Gandhi was there. She was not the prime minister then, but she was there, and she made it a point to go and celebrate that victory with the soldiers at the Hajipir Pass in Pakistan in 1965. In 1971, we all know what happened. So one of the standout features that when we look at the pages of history, is the closeness of the prime minister with the military chiefs at that point of time. That enabled the two wings, the political and the military wing, to work together very cohesively. There's an interesting anecdote which many of you would have heard, but which kind of amplifies what I've been talking about. When Mrs. Indira Gandhi planned to, so the Pakistani army was wreaking havoc in Bangladesh and inflicting millions of deaths in Bangladesh on civilians there. Mrs. Indira Gandhi called a meeting of the cabinet and decided to launch a war in Pakistan. And when she asked the cabinet that were they ready for the war and that she wanted to launch the war in the monsoons, everybody agreed, except for one man. It was General Sam Manekshaw, who told her that, look, at this point, I wouldn't be able to, I'm not ready because these are monsoons and the geography of Bangladesh is flooded by many rivers. My army wouldn't be able to cross. You'll have to give me some time to be ready. So she asked him, she said, okay, she agreed. And she asked him when. So he said he'll come back. So when he was ready, he launched the war, and she was ready to agree to his disagreement. She kind of agreed to his point. She understood that here was somebody coming with a degree of expertise and understanding of the geography and knew what to do. When General Manekshaw disagreed about launching the war in monsoons, the Prime Minister agreed with him. It was one of those famous anecdotes which led finally to the Indian forces launching war in the winter of December 1971, which proved to be a success. It was a 16-day war. The war ended in 16 days. General Manekshaw had kept his promise of winning the war when he was given the right opportunity and the right time to do so. So these are little anecdotes and features which kind of tell us the history of the relationship between the Prime Minister and the generals and the chiefs. So when General Sagat, who I was talking about, who won us those two battles against the Chinese in 1967, to him, Mrs. Indira Gandhi once said, and she landed at the helipad and General Sagat was there to receive him. And General Sagat was responsible for the Indian army capturing Dhaka. The political class believed that the army should sit by the side and keep pressing Pakistan, whereas General Sagat, in disagreement with his own military commanders, believed that he should capture Dhaka, because once you captured the soul of the enemy's territory, which was Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, you could actually completely dismantle the enemy. So and it succeeded. So when General Sagat met Mrs. Indira Gandhi at a helipad once, she told him famously that Sam, which is General Sam Manekshaw referring to him, said, Sam got me Bangladesh, you got me Dhaka. So there was also a kind of tacit understanding of the role of the generals in the war and what they brought by way of execution. In 1962, the defense minister interfered in the planning of the defense preparedness of India. A general's report of 1959-60 was disregarded, and India went to war with China at the behest of the political class and an acquiescing military class. They went to war underprepared and completely unplanned for what were the consequences that followed. So over a period of time, but you must say in all fairness that in 1962 India was just 15 years old as an independent nation. In retrospect, we can also say that the Chinese came, taught us a lesson, we understood, we took the lessons and beat them back in their own game in 1967. And And when we look at the whole progression from 1962 onwards, the tango between the prime minister and the defense minister and the generals have actually played a great part in India's planning, preparedness, and ultimate execution of the outcomes in the wars and the battles that followed. I would, and subsequently, India has had several histories of wars and battles, but these are examples, and this is how it moved. The dial shifted post the 1962 war with China, and gradually the understanding of the role of the military in a neighborhood which is fraught with different kinds of risks and adversaries was better understood by the political class. Many years later, in 1987, and this is again something that happened vis-a-vis China, against China, that the Chinese forces had moved close to at a place called Somdurongchu, where the Chinese forces there was a Chinese detachment which had come and sat inside Indian territory, as has been happening once in a while. That had been happening over history. The Chinese come and, they call it salami slicing, wherein they come and occupy a territory and over a period of time want to own that territory. So in 1987, a Chinese military detachment came and sat inside Indian territory, and India had prepared for that. So General Sundarji, General Sharma, who was the army commander at that time, General Sundarji was the army chief, they decided that they will move an entire brigade out there. There was a big standoff. But in that standoff, what had happened was the Indian forces had moved so quickly, as had happened in August last year, when the Indian forces, as you would have read in the newspapers, they occupied the heights, the Kailash heights, and thus putting China in a spot because they were sitting below and India was at the heights, and which resulted in the Chinese not being able to move any further last year after the Indian forces occupied the Kailash range heights. So in 87, in Somdurongchu, the Indian forces occupied the heights and virtually pushed China back. But in the process, there's some interactions that happened again between the military class and the political class, which actually is important to understand to see how India pushed back China. I'll give you an example there. So what happened was, because the military commanders are on the spot, they understand the lay of the land, the terrain, the situation that is obtaining at that point of time far better than somebody sitting in Delhi. At that point of time, General V.N. Sharma had said categorically that the Indian forces will not move back. General Sundarji had also agreed with him. So from Delhi, from the bureaucracy, there was deep pressure on General Sundarji to pull back the troops because they did not want any confrontation with China. General Sundarji responded to the bureaucrat by saying, the bureaucrat said, well, the Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi at that point of time, the Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi is not happy with the way you have been aggressively positioning troops against China, and he's worried. So General Sundarji's response to the bureaucrat was simple. Please tell your Prime Minister that he's probably not getting the right advice. To be fair to the Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi agreed with General Sundarji and actually made a trip to that place where the soldiers were there, the Indian soldiers. And because the bureaucrats wanted the Indian army to move back, General Sundarji and General Sharma wanted the Indian army to be where they are and push the Chinese back. There was a difference of opinion. So the Prime Minister, Rajiv Gandhi, went to Somdurongchu to address the troops. And this is what happens when you put your ear to the ground and understand what the situation on the ground is, what is the mood of the troops, what the leaders at the ground are saying. So when he asked the troops at a gathering, and I'll digress to Hindi on this because that's what he said. He said, "Yahan aap log yahan baithe hain, aapko kya karna hai? Yahan rehna hai ya wapas piche jana hai?" He wanted to understand the mood of the troops as to what are they thinking, what is their morale. So he said, "Aap logon ko yahan baithna hai ya piche jana hai?" He said, "Saab," one of them raised his hand, And he's telling the prime minister and it's not easy. So the soldier raised his hand. He stood up. He said, "Saab ji, हमें ना यहाँ रहना है, ना पीछे जाना है. आप हमें हुक्म दीजिए, हमें आगे जाना है." So it was a very simple reply, but it kind of exemplified the mood that was prevalent at that point of time. It has so happened in India's history, and Kargil is another point, where despite the initial shock and reverse, because the Pakistani troops came and occupied the heights, the Indian army could overturn that situation. The only army in the world that could overturn the situation was Indian army, because there were so many casualties, so many young leaders, young soldiers who died while taking out Pakistani troops from the heights. It's very difficult to fight troops, an army which is entrenched on the heights of those mountains, and when you have to climb up and take out the defensive forces who are there on those, embedded on those heights, entrenched on those heights. But the Indian army did that, and that was possible because of two things: political will and military execution. These are aspects that are very important when you look at how military execution or the military civil relationship can actually function at its best level, even in the most adverse of times. To wrap it up, in terms of the relations that have prevailed between the political and military class, one of the things that we sometimes forget, but which is so applicable in our case, are the tenets of Kautilya. Kautilya is the closest to propound realpolitik and understand the organization and war as tools of statecraft. What has happened in India is that we have lately understood the fact that we are in the middle of a neighborhood that is nuclear armed, that is terrorist filled, and that is full of friction and instability. And there we are as a glue in that neighborhood. We all know Kautilya was a key advisor to Chandragupta Maurya between 322 and I think about 185 BC. And there are a series of texts that he has propounded, whether on higher leadership, whether responsibilities of a leader in defending his subjects from external aggression is one of the important requirements of a leader of a nation. One of the things that evaded India in the early stages was that, and it continues to do so, was that most military leaders, most prime ministers, I would say, in some of the larger countries had some sort of military experience at early stages of their lives, whether it was Churchill, whether it was Mao Zedong as well, when he led his communist forces in a civil war, Roosevelt, and depended on Eisenhower for military advice. There was JFK with military experience. So there were many people who had closer connect with the operations and understanding of military purposes for nation building. So some of these aspects have also kind of been wedded or welded into India's understanding of military civil relations over the years, and how leadership at the civilian level or the political level needs to also take into account the military expertise. And the military expertise also has to understand the political implications that a prime minister or a minister needs to be aware of while taking decisions. India over the years has done well, has figured out a middle ground. And, there are several books on it. My friend Anit Mukherjee writes beautifully in his book, A Silent Dialogue, the relations between the political and military class over the years. And it's important to understand how the two, especially at the highest level, have taken decisions in various wars and various conflicts in various areas where India's foreign policy and military requirements have been paramount in understanding how India should take on a particular situation. I thought it was a good opportunity to discuss briefly where we are and how we have progressed. We talk about various aspects of history, but one of the things that gets ignored is this twin track of political and military decision making that, in India's case, as I explained a little while earlier, is so very important. So very important, when you look at where India is, and important because as we get into a more complex world where India plays a very important part, not just in India, but outside in the Indian Ocean region, in the South China Sea, alongside the members of the Quad, in the various trade blocs, and the overlapping political, economic, and trade aspects that India is going to be increasingly a part of. It's important to understand, therefore, the jugalbandi that a prime minister, his political class, and the military class would need to have to make India a successful nation in the global platform. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, sir. I believe that this would have been really uh, wonderful experience for our audience. We have some questions with us that I'd like to ask you. Uh, there's one question a student wants to ask. How strong is India military's capability when compared to countries like USA, China, and Korea?
So, well, I think there's no one answer to such questions. Such a question. It's an important question. It's an interesting question. The way to look at it is you have several parameters. Size is one. The weapons capability is the other. Experience is another, which we often ignore. So let me go through one by one. When we look at India, I think the US has larger budgets. Let's also understand what is the kind of budget that we have thought of for the army over the years, and then we'll come to where the capabilities lie. So India has had far lesser budgets over the years than the other countries. I would not take Korea into account here at this point of time. I don't know which Korea it is you're referring to. South Korea. Yes,
South Korea.
South Korea. Okay. So yes, let's say India, US, and China. I feel because they are very different in each way, in each of its ways. China, being an authoritarian communist regime, has had larger military budgets, military spending, has a larger military force than India. Definitely, has also spent a lot of money acquiring weapons and enhancing its naval capabilities. There is also, in a dictatorship, what tends to happen is that decision making, and that's something that I didn't touch upon as much while I was talking. Decision making is far more easier. When the US went to Pakistan in the 60s, they found that the Pakistanis, which were again run by the military at that point of time, found it easier to make decisions because the dictatorial regime run by a military dictator finds it easier to take on all those decisions, whether it is military budget, spending, acquisition of arms, etc. So China over the years has always remained ahead on that race. The US also is a bigger country, has a higher defense spend, has a larger role across the world in different continents. So the role, the capabilities, the defense spend, the technology aspects are far higher as far as India is concerned. The third dimension, which I spoke about, is the experience, which is extremely important in today's circumstance or any circumstances, especially when you look at how wars are going to be fought. I spoke about 1967. We spoke about Kargil as well. These are either limited battle or a limited war. So in a limited battle or a limited war, your experience counts for a lot more than the overall defense spend, because you're actually fighting in a very small territory. So when you look at when you look at the Ladakh skirmishes, etc., and you see how the experience of the Indian army in outwitting the Chinese, in outgunning the Chinese, and getting onto the Kailash heights after being initially surprised by the Chinese army, which broke the protocols, was actually responsible in India gaining an advantage in the standoff. And that is a primary factor, given that India from 1962, if you look at 1962 was India's defeat against China. But after that, the Indian army has mostly succeeded in all wars and battles that it has fought. It has not lost. It has either had a higher advantage in 65 or won an outright war in 71 or won the battles in 67. So it's been an upward climb for the Indian Army as far as experience is concerned. As far as China is concerned, after 1962, they have not won a single battle or war. They lost the 1967 battles to India. They lost the battles along the river Ussuri to Russians in 1969. They had a hard time against Vietnam in 1978. So I would put the analogy to cricket. You can have the best of bats and the greatest of equipment, but if you haven't had and if you look at the form, if you had last so many years not scoring too many centuries, then I would really doubt that batsman vis-a-vis somebody who has had a much better average with many runs on the board.
Sir, in this, you compared all the different armies over independence or how much decision making capabilities do they have. So, sir, it does not really more decision making ability does not really translate into better systems, right? Because it
Yeah.
also makes you more prone to coup and things like that.
Yes,
Uh,
yes, exactly. Yeah, that's what I meant. That in the neighborhood, if you see, and otherwise, Burma would have been a more more powerful nation than India, right, or somebody else. So you're absolutely right, and that those are the two pros and cons. Is that you have quicker decision making, but you're also prone to coup. You're also prone to disasters. I'll tell you how. You see, when Pakistan fought wars against India, they had the military dictators, but after every war, the military dictator was displaced because the military dictator had a higher ambition, and there was the public's expectation was such that, oh, you have a military leader, now he can put it across India. Ayub Khan 1965, Yahya Khan in 1971 were all replaced after the wars. And the reasons why they were replaced was that military leaders, if they don't succeed in wars, then they are thought of as, well, you were a military leader, you led us to the war, you were the expert, and yet you didn't. So the post-war effect is that a nation's sort of reliance on the military, its faith in its own military diminishes to a great extent. So you're right on that score. And I just added to what the other impact of that is.
Okay, all right, sir. Sir, there is this one more thing that we wanted to discuss with you. I personally wanted to discuss with you is
Sure.
that when Chinese government decide to send China's army on our land borders, we sort of always start discussing about that. Our attention goes towards it. But I was watching somewhere and reading somewhere about this, and they said that they employed this tactic not to gain any territorial lands, but instead so that we shift our concentration back to Indian Army from our Indian Navy, which is more significant if you think in terms of economic growth and the possibility for the same, as well as since the uh, economies now rely on there is this globalization happening and all the economies are interconnected. uh, the power that comes with handling sea routes should be great, and they always just manage to do this, manage to shift our attention by just some standoffs. So how far do you believe this analysis is correct?
Well, I think I wouldn't completely agree with this for one reason that, again, if you go back 6-7 years, ever since Xi Jinping has come to power from 2013, before Ladakh, there were 7 standoffs, right? At Daulat Beg Oldi and Doklam and Chumar. You had these 6 or 7 standoffs, and China agreed to have a standoff with India because it also always impose itself in terms of its outright, and it's always believed it's outrightly stronger than India. Also impose it. That's one. Second, as far as the Indian Navy is concerned, as far as I would just add the quad bit. Look, China doesn't want India to really block its sea. I think there is some noise on the.
Okay, so sorry, sir.
Yeah. Can you So what tends to happen is that if 70, 80, 82% actually of China's energy imports are through the Malacca Straits. So that is something that they're worried about. They have always been worried about. Uh, India as a nation is also a composite. Its armed forces mean its army, its air force, and its navy. So for China to believe that India would focus on its army because they would take us to the Himalayas, I wouldn't completely agree with it. That analysis, for one reason, also is that when you do that, you actually make India more aware of the other risks that are posed by China in other areas other than the Himalayas. So the entire discussion of Indian Ocean region and why India should strengthen its navy, why India should strengthen Quad, in effect, the Chinese action on the Himalayas has forced India's hands on Quad with Australia, US, and Japan. It has actually hastened the formation and the operationalization of Quad, which China wouldn't want at any cost. So I wouldn't agree with the fact that the focus was to push India towards developing the Indian Army and not the Indian Navy. I think it's when you look at India and China, it's a combination of several things. It's a combination of, and I've written in several of my columns and pieces about why India needs to take the dragon to the Indian Ocean when the dragon wants to take you to the Himalayas. So China's role in taking India on in the Himalayas, I don't think China would have thought that India wouldn't look at its navy. In fact, it's the opposite. When you do that, you make sure that you strengthen the other areas as well, and not sit on your backs and think that this Indian Ocean region is not going to be important at all. I think it's had a diametrically opposite effect.
Okay, sir. We have this one more question with us, and I guess you have discussed a bit about it, but somebody wants to know this, so I'll just ask it again. What were the exact incidents that happened during 1969? Sorry, 1967, along the Chinese border in Sikkim?
Yeah. So I would, since you've asked me this question, I would also nudge you to read Watershed 1967, because that has an entire series of happenings in that period preceding 1967. It's important to understand what happened in the time that preceded. Before I answer your question, I must also tell you that for 50 years, these battles that happened in 1967 were ignored by India, whether it's its political class, military class, or its class of academia or media, everywhere. It was not talked about, it was never mentioned, and it was forgotten. But 1967 was that year when India actually defeated China in two successive battles at Nathula and Chola. They are these border areas, the posts in Sikkim, at the Sikkim-China border. Please go and visit, and those are areas where India actually was facing Chinese aggression from 1965, and Nathula especially, and the Chinese forces thought that India was still under the psychological hammer of 1962. What happened then was that India beat back China in Nathula. Many Chinese lives were lost. Indian lives were lost as well. But China suffered a humiliating defeat. China believed that it was a happenstance. It was by chance, a flash in the pan. 15 days later, China launched another strike, tried to push India at Chola. This time they came up against the Gurkhas. And also, after 15 days, China suffered another defeat at the hands of the Indian Army. General Sagat Singh, who, in my mind, is one of the most able military commanders in history. And I'm not just talking about India, I'm talking about the world. So it's important for us to also understand that we have had military leaders who are one of the most able military leaders in the world. We haven't spoken about them. And he was one. So he registered two consecutive victories over China. The result of these victories were such that China never interfered thereafter in India's affairs with Pakistan. In 1971, when India went to war with Pakistan, there were several other reasons why China didn't interfere. But you must ask what those reasons are. There were reasons because the Soviets at that point of time had been befriended by India, and the Soviets threatened China that if the Chinese attacked India, the Soviets would overrun them. The other thing was that because in 67 we had pulverized them in two successive battles, the Chinese were psychologically scarred and did not really take up the cudgels against India or even move their forces outside, on the border across Sikkim. Despite the fact that Henry Kissinger and President Richard Nixon constantly urged China to act, to push India, to even browbeat India, to scare India to some extent. But even those exhortations by the US President and Secretary of State did not move China at all. So psychologically scarred they were. 1967's victories for India are absolutely important because for 50 long years, the Chinese never ever thought of raising a confrontation against India, barring a little skirmish in 1975. But for 50 long years, China never took on India. And you go back to the date of 1967. My book, that's the reason, is called Watershed 1967, because that was the start of India's psychological dominance over China for over a half a century and more.
Okay, sir. I would like to thank you for such a wonderful session. I'm sure our audience would have gained a lot through this webinar. And I would also like to thank our audience for joining us, and stay tuned to EML's YouTube channel. We would be coming up with a lot of more informative and educational webinars like this.